The crystal red zero and the great hall of House Ardyn laughed at me for the fourth and final time. I had stood on that same dais at 16, at 17, at 18, at 19, and each year I had pressed my palm to the awakening crystal and watched it stay dark and cold, while 200 nobles in their best silk waited to see whether the Ardyn defect would finally amount to something. Each year it stayed dark. Each year the laughter got a little more comfortable, a little more certain, the way cruelty always does once it stops being afraid of being wrong. But 20 was the last test. The law was clear. A noble who could not light the crystal by his 20th year was no longer, in the eyes of the houses, a noble at all. So this time the laughter had teeth. 0, announced the master, reading the dead crystal with the bored voice of a man who had already written his report. Manacor undetectable. Awakening failed. For the 4th consecutive year. I want to tell you I felt something dramatic in that moment. I didn't. I had felt everything dramatic years ago and used it all up. What I felt, standing there with my palm flat against a cold stone while my own blood relatives smirked behind their wine, was a kind of clean, distant clarity. The clarity of a man watching the last door he'd been quietly hoping about finally close, and being almost relieved that the hoping was over. My father did not look at me. That was the part that landed. Lord Cael Ardyn, patriarch of the house, sat on his high seat in his grey furs and looked at a point slightly above my head, the way you look at a stain you've decided to have someone else clean. Remove the failure's name from the registry, he said. Not to me. To the steward. He is no longer an Ardyn. He'll be sent to the Hollowmere estate to make himself useful in service. The house has indulged this embarrassment long enough. Hollowmere. Even the servants knew Hollowmere, a dying border estate 3 days north, all frost and bog and back taxes, the place the house sent things it wanted to forget without the trouble of burying them. And then my brother spoke, because Damon could never let a wound close without putting his thumb in it. Damon Ardyn. 23, the golden one, the genius who'd lit the crystal at 14 and never once let anyone forget it. He rose from his seat with a goblet in his hand and the easy smile of a man who has never in his life been told no, and he raised the goblet to me like a toast. Don't look so grim, little brother, he said, loud enough for the whole hall. Not everyone's born to cultivate. Somebody has to carry the chamber pots. He smiled wider. Truly, it's a kind of gift. You'll finally be good at something. The hall enjoyed that one enormously. Here is the thing I had learned in 4 years of being the Ardyn family's favorite joke. When you cannot win, you can at least refuse to perform the loss they've scripted for you. So I didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't give them the wet-eyed defect they'd come to watch. I took my palm off the crystal, inclined my head to my father with a precision that was almost insolent, and said, in a voice that carried further than I intended, "Of course, father. I'll go quietly. I'd hate to embarrass the house any more than my existence already does." It wasn't defiance, exactly. It was just the truth said politely, which is a thing nobles cannot stand, because politeness is supposed to be the wrapping they put on their cruelty, not a blade you hand back to them. For 1 second, one single second, the laughter caught, and my father's eyes finally came down off the wall and landed on me, narrow and cold, and for the first time in 20 years, genuinely paying attention. Then a guard's hand closed on my shoulder, and they walked the defect out of the great hall of his own ancestors, and the heavy doors boomed shut behind me on the only family I'd ever had. I'd love to tell you that's where the story turns. That somewhere in that long, humiliating walk, fate reached down and lit a fire in me. It didn't. Not yet. Fate, in my experience, has terrible timing. The fire came that night. They gave me 1 night in the servants' wing before the wagon north, a stone cell with a straw pallet, a single candle, and a small barred window looking out at the mountains I'd never been past. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, and for the first time since I was a child, with no one watching, I let it hurt. My mother had been a concubine, a low-born singer my father took for a season and discarded when she got inconvenient. She died when I was 6, and her last words to me, I remember them with the awful exactness you remember the things that shaped you, were not "be strong" or "I love you." They were, "Cael, whatever they say you are, they're measuring with the wrong instrument. Promise me you'll remember that. They're measuring with the wrong instrument." I'd held on to that line for 14 years the way a drowning man holds a plank, and that night, in that cell, I finally let it go, because the instrument had measured me 4 times. 0, 0, 0, 0. At some point, a man has to stop blaming the ruler and accept that he is simply short. "You were wrong, mother," I said to the empty cell, very quietly. I checked. 4 times. There's nothing here to measure. And the forgotten God, who had been waiting inside me for 20 patient years, chose that exact moment to prove me wrong. It did not feel like awakening a manticore. I'd had it described to me 100 times by people gloating about theirs. A warm spring opening in the gut, a river of energy you learn to channel. This was nothing like that. This was the floor of the world dropping out. It started as heat behind my breastbone, then heat everywhere, then a sound, not in my ears but in my bones, a vast slow voice, speaking a language that predated language, saying something I felt rather than heard. "There you are." I have been asleep a long time. The candle flame stood up straight and turned white. The water in the clay cup beside me rose out of the cup and hung in the air in a trembling sphere. The crack in the stone wall I'd been staring at sealed itself, the stone flowing like cooling wax, leaving the wall smoother than the masons had made it. And the cut on my hand, a shallow thing from the crystal's iron rim, closed. Not scabbed. Closed, the skin knitting in a heartbeat, leaving not even a scar, leaving it cleaner than before I'd been cut. I sat very still in a room full of impossible things and did the only intelligent thing available to a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been rewritten. I shut my mouth, I controlled my breathing, and I thought. 4 years. 4 times the crystal read 0. And here was power enough to seal stone and stop wounds and lift water against its own nature, sitting in me the whole time, silent. Which meant one of 2 things. Either I had just conveniently awakened on the worst night of my life, or the crystal had never been able to read this at all. That whatever this was, it was not manna, not the thing the houses measured and ranked and worshipped. It was something the instrument was not built to see. They're measuring with the wrong instrument. I started laughing then, alone in a cell, the quiet, helpless laughter of a man who has just realized the joke was never on him. My mother hadn't been comforting a failure. She had known. Somehow that low-born singer my father threw away had known exactly what her son was. And in the dark behind my breastbone, that vast, slow, ancient voice spoke one more time, and this time I understood it perfectly, and it changed the shape of the rest of my life. "They will come for me when they feel me wake. Hide. Grow. And when you are ready, let them remember what they tried so hard to forget." I did not know, that night, what I had inherited. I didn't know the name of the thing in my blood, or who had buried it, or that there was an entire church 3 centuries old whose only real purpose was hunting men exactly like me. I would learn all of that, and the learning would nearly kill me. But I knew 3 things by dawn, and they were enough to build a life on. I knew that I was not empty. I knew that the most powerful weapon I would ever own was that every person who had ever looked at me had decided completely that I was worthless, and people do not guard against a threat they're certain doesn't exist. And I knew, with the cold, clean clarity that had replaced my heartbreak somewhere in the night, that I was going to let House Ardyn keep believing it, for as long as it took. I would go to Hollowmere as the defect they discarded. I would carry their chamber pots, if that's what it took. And I would grow this thing in the dark and the silence until the day I chose to stop hiding. And on that day, I was going to walk back into that great hall, and I was going to make every smirking one of them understand precisely what instrument they should have been measuring me with. The wagon came at dawn. I climbed into it without a word, the perfect picture of a broken, coreless failure being carted off to die quietly in the north. I had never felt more dangerous in my life. The road to Hollowmere took 3 days, and I spent them learning the rules of the thing in my blood, the way you learn to handle a blade in the dark, slowly, privately, and with enormous respect for how badly it could cut me. I learned that it answered intention more than gesture. That small uses cost me almost nothing, sealing a splinter cut, warming my hands against the northern cold, sharpening my hearing until I could catch the driver muttering about the poor cursed defect he was hauling to the bog. I learned that larger uses left me hollow and shaking, and that the power seemed to grow a little each time I pushed it and recovered, like a muscle, like a debt that paid interest. And I learned, most importantly, restraint. Every time I was tempted to do something visible, something satisfying, I made myself stop and ask the only question that mattered now. Does this buy me more than it costs? It almost never did. So I did almost nothing, and I watched, and I waited, and the driver delivered to Hollowmere exactly the meek, beaten, useless young man he'd been paid to deliver. The bandits found us on the second night, and they taught me more about myself in 10 minutes than I'd learned in 2 days of careful experiment. We'd camped at the edge of the Greywood, the driver and I, and they came out of the dark the way desperate men do, 6 of them, ragged, with notched blades, and the particular flat eyes of people who've decided other lives are worth less than their own hunger. They wanted the wagon, the horse, whatever coin a house transport might carry. The driver, a decent enough man who'd done nothing but pity me the whole road, put himself in front of the horse with a cudgel and the doomed courage of someone about to die for an animal, and I sat very still on the wagon bench and did my arithmetic. Does this buy me more than it costs? 6 armed men against an old driver and a coreless boy. If I did nothing, the driver died, and I likely did too, and the last ember of a murdered god went out in a ditch in the Greywood, which would have made the entire Ashen Church's 3-century vigil look retroactively absurd. If I acted, if I revealed even a sliver, there were 6 witnesses who'd carry the story. But witnesses, I was already beginning to understand, are only dangerous if they live to be believed. And these 6 had walked up to a wagon in the dark, fully certain they were the most dangerous things in the clearing. There it was again. The certainty. The same gift my whole family had given me, offered now by strangers. So I stepped down off the wagon, and I let them see a thin unarmed boy in a servant's tunic, and the bandit captain laughed and told me to kneel, and I told the rope on his own belt, the coil he used to bind what he stole, that it was a living thing and that it was angry. It was the first time I'd tried to tell a lie that big to the world, and the world, after a moment's resistance, believed me. The rope came alive in a snapping coil and took the captain off his feet, and while the other 5 stood frozen in the kind of confusion that has no place to put itself, I told the ground that it was water and let 3 of them flounder, and told the fire that it was hungry and let it leap at the last 2, and I did all of it without raising a hand, standing perfectly still in the firelight, which is the thing that broke them. They ran. They left their captain and their blades and their certainty in the dirt, and they ran into the Greywood, telling each other a story they'd never be able to make anyone sober believe. The driver stared at me. I told him, gently, that he'd hit his head, that the bandits had simply fled at the sight of a house wagon, that nothing strange had happened at all, and because the truth I offered was so much more comfortable than the one he'd witnessed, he took it, the way people always take the comfortable lie. By morning he half believed it himself. But I didn't sleep that night, and not from fear. I lay in the wagon looking up at the cold stars, and I thought about my mother. I'd been 6 when she died, and the house had not let me grieve her properly. A concubine's death was an administrative matter, not a loss. So I'd done my grieving in pieces, over years, in stolen moments, the way you eat when you're not allowed at the table. And lying in that wagon with a god newly woken in my blood, I finally understood the thing about her that had never made sense. She'd sung in the great hall, my mother. That was how my father found her, a low-born voice good enough to entertain nobles. But she'd also, I remembered now, been afraid of crystals. wouldn't go near the awakening crystal at festivals, wouldn't let the measuring priests touch her, laughed it off as superstition. I'd thought it was a peasant's silliness. It wasn't. She'd known what she carried. She'd known that the instrument that measured worth was the same instrument that, in the wrong hands, hunted. And she'd spent her whole short, discarded life making sure no one ever measured her closely enough to find the god sleeping in her blood. And then she'd passed it to me and died and left me with 7 words and a lifetime to understand them. They're measuring with the wrong instrument. Not comfort. A warning and a weapon and an inheritance, all folded into a thing small enough for a child to carry without knowing what he held. By the time the sun came up over the gray wood, I had stopped grieving my mother as a victim. I'd started understanding her as the first and cleverest ally I'd ever had, a woman who'd hidden a god in the one place 3 centuries of hunters would never think to look. Inside someone everyone agreed was worthless. I intended to honor that. I intended to be exactly as invisible as she'd taught me, for exactly as long as it took. Hollowmere was worse than its reputation, which is an achievement. It was a sprawl of gray stone and rotting timber on the edge of a freezing bog, half its buildings empty, its fields gone to reed and frost. Perhaps 40 servants and tenants still lived there, the people the house had no other use for, working land that no longer paid for itself. The estate owed the house 3,000 gold in back levies it would never make, which meant everyone there knew, with the particular hopelessness of the forgotten, that they were one bad winter from being abandoned entirely. And it was run by a man named Vargas. Steward Vargas was the kind of small, cruel man that powerful families breed and then deploy to places they don't want to think about, given just enough authority to be a tyrant and just little enough that no one above him would ever notice what he did with it. He was waiting in the muddy yard when the wagon arrived, a thick man with a soft face and a riding crop he didn't own a horse for, and he looked me over the way a butcher looks at a thin animal. "So you're the disgrace," he said. "Lord Theron's little mistake. They told me you think you're better than this place." He smiled. "We'll fix that. There's no lords here, boy. There's me. And there's the work. You'll learn the work." Behind him, the servants of Hollowmere had gathered to look at the new arrival, and their faces were the faces of people who had learned to enjoy watching someone else become the steward's new favorite target, because while Vargas had a new toy, he wasn't breaking them. All except one. She stood a little apart from the others, a young woman about my own age in a patched servant's dress, with her sleeves rolled past raw, red hands, and her chin up in a way that the others had long since learned to keep down. She wasn't smirking. She was looking at me with something I had not seen on a single face in that grand hall full of my own family. She was looking at me like she was sorry. Like she'd watched a lot of new arrivals come through that gate already broken and was bracing herself to watch it happen again. Her name, I would learn, was Lyra, and she was the first person in my entire life who was kind to me before she had any reason to be. Before I was powerful, before I was useful, when I was nothing but one more discarded thing the bog had been sent to swallow. I have built an empire since then. I have brought a church 3 centuries old to its knees, and made the Lord who branded me kneel in his own hall. People ask me, sometimes, when it really began, the rise, the legend, all of it. It didn't begin in that cell, with the god waking in my blood. It began in that muddy yard, when a servant girl with raw hands looked at the worthless defect everyone had thrown away, and decided, for no reason that would profit her at all, to be kind. That was the day I stopped wanting to merely survive House Ardyn. That was the day I started wanting to build something worth protecting from it. "Get him a pallet in the East Barracks," Vargas told her, already bored of me. "And boy, Don Bell. Miss it and you don't eat. Lord's sons don't get special treatment here." He smiled his soft, cruel smile. "Especially not ones their own fathers threw away." "Yes, steward," I said, in the meek, beaten voice I had been practicing for 3 days. "Thank you for the work." He liked that. They always like it when you thank them. Lyra led me toward the barracks through the cold, and when we were out of Vargas's earshot, she said, quietly, not looking at me, don't thank him again. He hears gratitude and he hears weakness. Just do the work and stay small, and he'll find someone else to enjoy by spring. Stay small. She meant it as survival advice, the hard-won wisdom of a person who'd lasted in this place. She had no idea she'd just described exactly the strategy I had already chosen for entirely different reasons. Thank you, I said to her, and then, catching myself, for the advice. Not for the work. And Lyra, the first person to be kind to me in 20 years, almost smiled. Behind us, in the freezing dark of the bog, something old and patient turned over in my blood and waited, exactly as I did, to grow. I had 3,000 gold of someone else's debt over my head, a tyrant for a master, a god's bloodline I didn't understand, and a church I didn't yet know existed already turning its blind face north to hunt the thing waking inside me. It was by a wide margin the most hope I had ever had. There is a particular freedom in being thought worthless, and it took me about a week at Hollowmere to understand exactly how valuable it was. A man with a mana core is watched. The houses track their cultivators like racehorses, their progress measured, their rivals counted, every gain noted by someone who'd profit from their fall. But a defect, a coreless failure carting peat out of a bog, no one watches what they've already written off. I could have set the barracks on fire with my mind, and Vargas would have blamed the chimney. The certainty that I was nothing was the thickest armor I have ever worn, and I had 200 nobles to thank for forging it. So I wore it, and underneath it I worked. The visible work was brutal and stupid, hauling peat, mending fences, breaking ice on the troughs before the dawn bell, all under Vargas's soft, cruel eye. I did it without complaint, in the meek, beaten manner I'd perfected on the road, and within days I had successfully become invisible, just another bent back in the cold, which freed my nights entirely. The invisible work was the bloodline. Every night, after the barracks went quiet, I slipped out to the old drainage cut at the bog's edge, a place no one went because it stank, and because Vargas had decided long ago there was nothing out there worth stealing, and I learned what I was. Slowly, carefully, asking my single question every time, does this buy me more than it costs? I learned the shape of the power across those weeks. It was, at its root, a power over the truth of things, over what a thing fundamentally was. I could tell a wound it was whole, and it would believe me and close. I could tell cold water it was still, and it would hold its shape in the air. I could tell cracked stone it was sound, and it would knit. It was not fire and lightning, not the flashy destructive mana the houses prized. It was quieter and far stranger, and, I was beginning to suspect, far worse to be on the wrong end of, because what do you do against a man who can simply edit the wound out of his own body, the fear out of his own heart, the crack out of the wall you've backed him against? And it grew. That was the part that mattered. Every night I pushed a little further and recovered, and every morning the ceiling was a little higher than the night before. I had spent 20 years watching other people's power as a fixed thing, a number on a crystal. Mine wasn't a number. It was a slope. And slopes, given enough time, climb higher than any number a crystal can hold. Old Bran found me out in the third week. Not the power, the place. He was the estate's oldest tenant, a one-eyed veteran of some war the houses had since decided to forget, with a face like a dropped boot and a habit of being exactly where you didn't expect. He came down to the drainage cut one night while I was sitting in the reeds with frost not forming on me, a small economy, telling the cold around me it wasn't there. And he looked at the uniced ground in a ring around me, and he looked at me, and he didn't run, and he didn't gloat. He sat down on a rock, took out a pipe he had no tobacco for, and said, "My grandmother had a word for what you're not doing right now." Old word. Pre-church. He looked at me with his one eye. She'd have called it God work, boy. And she'd have told you to run, because the last people who could do God work all died at the same time, in the same year, and it wasn't an accident. That was the first I heard of it. The first crack of light into the thing in my blood. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt the strangest sensation, the sensation of a man who has been told his whole life he is a blank page finally being handed the first word of his own name. Tell me everything your grandmother said, I told him. And Bran, if you tell anyone what you saw, I won't have to do anything to you. Vargas will. The moment he thinks you've gone strange, you're the next one in the cold. It wasn't a threat I'd ever have carried out. It was a truth he already knew, handed to him politely, which I was learning was my sharpest tool. But if you keep my secret, old man, I think I can do something about Vargas, and about this whole frozen tomb of a place. Would you like that? He was quiet a long moment, the pipe unlit in his teeth. Then he said, I've watched this estate die for 30 years, boy. Watched good people break on that man's crop. If you've got God work in you and a reason to use it. He stood, his old knees cracking. Then I've got an old man's stories and an old man's loyalty and not a thing left to lose. Both are yours. Bran's stories became my school. He had only fragments, a grandmother's half-remembered prayers, a soldier's lifetime of noticing what the church was too careful about. But fragments were more than I'd had, and I assembled them in the lamplight night after night like a man rebuilding a shattered map. There had been temples once, he said, in the high places, before the church. They'd been thrown down so thoroughly that people now used their foundation stones for sheepfolds without knowing what they walked on. There had been a word the old people used when a thing was set right that had been wrong, a word the church had made unlucky, so that now mothers told children not to say it. And there had been, his grandmother swore, a promise woven into the murdered god's death. That truth cannot be killed, only buried, and that a buried thing is just a planted thing that hasn't been given a reason to grow. She used to say the god wasn't dead. Bran told me one night, his one eye reflecting the fire. She said it was waiting. Said you can't kill what things actually are. You can only stop people from looking. And someday, she said, the looking would start again. He knocked his cold pipe against his boot. I thought she was a daft old woman. Buried her thinking it. And now here's a boy in my bog telling the frost it isn't there. He looked at me a long moment. I owe her an apology I can't give. So you'll have to do, boy. Whatever you're growing into out here, I'd like to live long enough to see the looking start again. I taught myself in those weeks the way I imagine a smith teaches himself a new metal, by ruining a great deal of it first. The bloodline answered intention, but intention is a slippery thing, and a half-meat lie to the world produced half results, or worse. I told a dead sapling it was alive, and it stood green for a day, and then rotted black, because I hadn't believed it all the way down, and the world is not fooled by a man who isn't sure. I learned that the God's power was, at its root, a kind of total conviction, that to tell the world a thing was true, I had to mean it more completely than I'd ever meant anything, with no corner of doubt left anywhere in me. Which is, when you think about it, the hardest discipline there is. Most people can't fully convince themselves of a thing they know to be true. I had to fully convince reality of things that weren't yet. It turned out that 20 years of being told I was nothing had been, of all things, the perfect training. Because a man who has had to decide, alone, against all evidence and every voice, that he is worth something, has already practiced believing a truth the whole world denies. The God hadn't chosen a random vessel. It had chosen the one kind of person built to wield it. Someone the world had spent a lifetime telling they were a lie, who'd had to learn to believe otherwise anyway. That was the second loyalty I earned at Hollowmere. I noticed, collecting them faster than House Ardyn ever had, and I was offering nothing but the truth and a little hope. It made me wonder, not for the last time, whether my father had ever understood that loyalty given is worth 10 times loyalty extracted, or whether men like him simply never needed to learn, because fear had always been cheaper. Vargas taught me how cheap fear was about a month in, when he nearly killed a man over a broken cart. The man's name was Toller, a tenant farmer, with a bad leg and a wife and a debt to the estate store that Vargas kept exactly large enough to never let him leave. A cart axle snapped under a load Vargas had ordered overstacked. The peat went into the bog, and Vargas, who had overstacked it himself, needed someone to be at fault who wasn't him. So he had Toller tied to the yard post in the freezing dark and took his riding crop to the man's back while the whole estate was made to watch, the way my whole family had been made to watch me, because cruelty performed is cruelty multiplied. Anyone want to take his place? Vargas asked the gathered servants, panting between strokes. No? Then watch. This is what carelessness costs. This is what I cost. I stood in that crowd in my meek, invisible armor, and I did the arithmetic I had promised myself I would always do. Does this buy me more than it costs? If I stopped him now, openly, I'd reveal myself months before I was strong enough or established enough to survive it. The house would hear there was something strange about the defect at Hollowmere. The patient thing in my blood would have its hiding broken for one man's back. And I looked at Toller's face, and at his wife's, and at Lyra standing white-knuckled at the edge of the crowd with her jaw clenched against her own helplessness. And I made the first real decision of my second life. Not the smart one. The right one. I had spent 20 years being the thing the powerful broke for sport, while everyone watched and no one moved. I was done being in that crowd. I just wasn't going to be stupid about it. So I didn't stop Vargas openly. I stopped him invisibly. I told the leather of his riding crop, very quietly, from across the yard, that it was old and rotten, which, with a little insistence, it became. It snapped at the next stroke, the business end flying into the bog. I told the frozen mud under his feet that it was wet, and Steward Vargas, mid-tantrum, went down hard on his soft backside in front of every soul he ruled, and the crack of his dignity hitting the ice was, I am told, audible from the barracks. It should have been nothing. A broken crop, a slip on ice. But humiliation is a current, and it only flows one direction, and a tyrant who has spent years building fear survives entirely on never, ever being laughed at. Someone in the crowd made a sound, just one, quickly swallowed. But Vargas heard it. And I watched the thing every small, cruel man is most afraid of move through him like cold water. The suspicion that the people he ruled were no longer entirely certain they should. That night I healed Toller's back in the dark of his hut, told the torn skin it was whole, left him sleeping and unmarked, and certain by morning he'd dreamed the beating. I told his terrified wife only that the bog had old spirits, and that sometimes they were kind, and to keep it to herself. And I let the estate wake up to a steward with a bruised tailbone and a snapped crop, and a farmhand whose wounds had vanished overnight, and I let them whisper, because whispers in a hopeless place are the first green thing that grows. That was the beginning of the part of the story the songs get wrong. The songs say I raised Hollowmere from the dead by the power of a god, and that's true enough for a song. But it wasn't lightning from the sky. It was a season of small, impossible kindnesses that no one could trace, all of them buying more than they cost. A failing well that suddenly ran clean and sweet. I'd told the poisoned water it was pure. A blighted barley field that came in golden while every neighbor's rotted. I'd spent a dozen freezing nights telling each sickened root that it was healthy, one plant at a time, which is the least romantic miracle in the history of miracles, and nearly broke me with the tedium. A child's killing fever that broke at dawn. A roof that should have collapsed under snow weight and simply, quietly held. None of it traceable to the meek defect hauling peat. All of it real. The hardest of those miracles, and the one I'm proudest of, wasn't the well, or the barley, or the broken fever. It was a man named Edric. Edric was Hollowmere's drunk. Every forgotten place has one. A big ruined man who'd been the estate's best builder before the despair got into him, and who now spent his days soaked in the rough spirit the store sold on credit it would never collect. Vargas used him as a cautionary tale. See what you become if you give up. The other servants had written him off completely, the way the house had written off the whole estate, the way the world had written off me. A zero, beyond saving. I couldn't heal what was wrong with Edric. The god in my blood can tell a wound it never happened, but it cannot tell a man his grief never happened, cannot edit the thing that broke him out of his own history. And I wouldn't have, even if I could, because a person's pain is part of the truth of them. and I'd sworn off deciding which parts of people got to be erased. So I did the slower thing. I sat with him. I gave him work that mattered. The new granary needed a builder, and I told him plainly that I'd seen what he used to be and didn't believe it was gone, just buried. I did for Edric exactly what my mother had done for me. I told him the instrument everyone measured him with was the wrong one, and then I waited, and I gave him reasons, one day at a time, to check. It took the whole season. But the granary that held Holomir's first real harvest in 11 years was built by Edric's hands, sober, and the day he finished it he stood looking at the thing he'd made with an expression I knew intimately. The expression of a man discovering that the number he'd been assigned was never the truth about him. He didn't know about the God in my blood. He thought I'd simply been kind. And the strange thing, the thing I'm still learning, is that he wasn't wrong. The kindness was the real miracle. The bloodline could fix a well. Only attention could fix a man, and attention costs no God's power at all, just the willingness to look at a thing the world calls worthless and refuse to believe it. And Holomir, for the first time in 30 years, began to live. The fields paid. The store debts which Vargas used as leashes started, to his visible fury, getting paid off, because people with full barns can settle accounts. The 40 broken souls who'd been waiting to be abandoned began, cautiously, to stand a little straighter and to look at the bog not as the place they'd die, but as the place that had, against all sense, started keeping them alive. They didn't know it was me. They thought it was luck, or the old spirits, or simply that they were finally due. I let them think it. A miracle everyone owns is worth more than a miracle with your name on it. Another thing my father, who put his name on everything and earned the love of no one, never understood. Lyra knew something, though. She was too sharp not to. She never accused me. She just started appearing, bringing me the warm half of the bread, sitting with me in the rare, quiet hours, asking questions that were a little too precise. Funny how the well went sweet the same week you started drawing from it. Funny how taller heals like a man half his age now. She'd watch my face when she said it, and I'd give her nothing, and she'd let it go. But the not pushing was its own kind of message. She was telling me, in the only way a careful person in a dangerous place can, I see you. I won't say it out loud. I'm on your side. One night, late, after she'd watched me, luckily, find the lost estate seal that would let the tenants prove their paid debts against Vargas's crooked ledger, she said it almost straight. You're not what they sent us, she said. Whatever the crystal said about you, Cael, it was measuring with the wrong instrument. I had not told her my mother's words. I had never told anyone my mother's words. And hearing them come out of Lyra's mouth, unprompted, in the cold, undid something in me that 20 years of cruelty had carefully sealed shut. My mother used to say exactly that, I said, before I could stop myself. Those exact words. Smart woman. She was a discarded concubine who died poor and forgotten, I said. The house would tell you she was nothing. Lyra looked at me with those sharp, kind, unbroken eyes, and she said the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 decades. The house calls everything it's afraid of nothing. It called this whole estate nothing. Look at it now. She nodded out at Holomir, at the lit windows, the full barns, the people who'd stopped waiting to die. Maybe nothing is just the word powerful people use for the things they don't understand how to measure. I think I started loving her a little in that exact moment. Not the way the songs mean it. The way you love the first person who ever looked at the real thing under your armor and didn't look away. But love and miracles both leave tracks, and 3 days later the tracks reached the wrong eyes. A house auditor rode into Holomir, a thin, precise man with a ledger and an escort of 2 house guards, sent north because the numbers had done something numbers were not supposed to do at a dying estate. Holomir had paid its quarterly levy in full. For the first time in 11 years. He stood in the prosperous yard of a place the house had written off, looking at full granaries and healthy tenants and a well that ran sweet, and I watched his thin, precise face do the calculation that I had been dreading since the first night. the calculation that would eventually bring the whole weight of my father's world down on this little estate. Something is happening here that should not be possible. And the house does not like impossible things it cannot explain. It likes to own them, or it likes to erase them. Who manages this estate's affairs? The auditor asked Vargas, who was bowing and sweating and taking credit for prosperity he'd done everything to prevent. I do, my lord, I do. It's been my management, my reforms. It isn't, the auditor said flatly, not even looking at him. He had the eyes of a man who read ledgers the way I read wounds. He could see where the truth had been edited. These numbers don't move like management. They move like something else. He turned slowly, and his gaze swept the yard full of servants looking for the thing that didn't fit. And I stood there in my meek invisible armor, a bent-back defect with frost on his collar, and for one cold moment the auditor's eyes passed over me, and stopped, and held. Not because he saw the god in my blood. He couldn't, no instrument the house owned could, but because some animal part of him, the part that had made him good at finding hidden truths in dishonest ledgers, snagged on the one servant in that yard who was standing perfectly, unnaturally still, and watching him back with eyes that did not belong on a broken thing. I dropped my gaze a half-second too late. You, the auditor said. The new one. Lord Theron's. Reassignment. He consulted his ledger. Cael. The one who failed the crystal. A thin smile. How interesting that this place started living the season the dead boy arrived. He closed the ledger with a soft, final snap. I think the house will want to take a much closer look at you. And just like that, 3 months of patient hiding ended, and the long road back to the great hall, the one that ended with my father on his knees, began. I had wanted more time. I always wanted more time. But the thing in my blood turned over, patient and growing, and whispered the only comfort it ever offered. Then we begin sooner than we planned. Good. Let them look closer. Let them lean all the way in. That's always been the trick with people who are certain you're nothing. You just have to wait for them to get close enough to learn otherwise. The summons came in the form of 4 house guards and a sealed letter, and the letter was a masterpiece of my father's particular cruelty. It did not say, "Come home." It did not say we wish to understand the prosperity of Hollowmere. It said, in Lord Theron's own cramped hand, the house requires the servant Cael to attend the Ardyn betrothal tournament, to serve at table, and to participate in the undercard exhibition bouts for the entertainment of our guests. I read it twice before I understood the elegance of the insult. They weren't bringing me home to investigate the miracle. They decided the prosperous estate was a fluke beneath their notice, and they were bringing the family defect back to the capital for one reason: to be beaten bloody in a practice ring in front of the most powerful house in the region, as a warm-up act, a joke between the real matches. A reminder, staged for an audience of 2,000, of exactly what an Ardyn who fails is worth. Damon's idea, I'd have bet my life. It had his fingerprints all over it. The need to humiliate me not in private, which would have sufficed, but spectacularly, publicly, in front of people whose opinion mattered. My brother never could leave a wound alone. Lyra read the letter over my shoulder and went very still. They want to hurt you in front of everyone. They want to hurt the idea of me, I said. The defect who got above himself. It's a lesson aimed at this whole estate, really, sent through my body. I folded the letter. Don't worry. I'm going to go. Cael. I'm going to go, I said again, and I'm going to be very, very careful, and I am going to come back. But Lyra, I held her eyes. When I come back, it's going to be different. They're about to lean all the way in, and I've decided to let them. She didn't ask what I meant. She just took my hand, the second person in my life to do that, and the only one who counted, and said, "Then come back." That's the only part of the plan I care about. The Ardyn seat looked smaller than I remembered. That's the strange thing about going back to the place that broke you, once you've stopped letting it. The great hall I'd been humiliated in, the towers I'd grown up beneath as a stain on the family name, 3 months earlier, they'd been the entire size of the world. Now I walked through the gates, a servant among servants, head bowed in my meek armor, and the whole grand edifice of House Ardyn looked to me like exactly what it was. A mid-tier house clawing desperately upward, throwing a tournament it couldn't quite afford to impress a greater house it was terrified of, papering over its insecurity with silk and spectacle. My father had spent my whole life making me feel small. It had never once occurred to me that he did it because he felt small too. The betrothal was the whole point of everything. Daemon was to be wed to Seraphine Veron, and the alliance would lift House Ardyn from mid-tier scrabbling into the orbit of real power. The tournament was the celebration. 3 days of bouts and feasting, the cream of two houses' young cultivators showing off their cores, while the adults negotiated the terms of the merger that the marriage really was. And somewhere in the undercard, between the matches that mattered, the Ardyn defect would be put in a ring to be thrashed for laughs. The journey south was its own education because I made the road crew take me through 3 villages on House Ardyn land, and I looked at them with eyes I hadn't had the first time I'd lived among them. As a child, I'd seen the house's lands the way a child sees the sky, simply there, the natural order. Now I saw the truth of them, the way the god in my blood saw everything, the tenant farmers paying levies that left them one bad season from Hollowmere's fate, the measuring priests who came each year to test the children and sort them, at 16, into worthy and worthless before they'd had a chance to be anything at all. The whole vast machine of the house, grinding human worth into a single number on a crystal and discarding the remainder. I had been the remainder. So had my mother. So, I now understood, were thousands of people who'd never lit a crystal and had spent their lives believing the dark stone had told them the truth about themselves. It made the thing I was walking toward feel larger than revenge. Revenge was for Daemon, for my father, for the people who'd laughed. But the machine was bigger than them, and older, and it didn't laugh. It just measured and sorted and discarded, with the bland confidence of a thing that has never once doubted its own instrument. Beating Daemon in a ring would be satisfying. Breaking the certainty that let a crystal decide a child's worth, that would be worth a second life. I served at table the first 2 days. I poured wine for the people who'd laughed at me, and I watched and I learned, because 2 days of being invisible at a noble gathering teaches you more than 2 years of being a guest. I learned that the Veron party was not nearly as committed to the alliance as my father believed, that Lord Veron's smiles were the smiles of a man keeping a lesser house on the hook while he waited for a better offer. I learned that Daemon was drinking too much and laughing too loud, the way a man does when he can feel a thing he wants slipping. And I learned, pouring wine for him personally while he pretended not to recognize his own brother, that Seraphine Veron looked at her intended husband with the particular cold patience of a woman in a transaction she did not choose. None of it was my business. All of it was useful. I filed it away because information is just power that hasn't been spent yet, and I was a man who'd learned to hoard power in silence. Daemon came to gloat the night before the bout, which was the first mistake he made in front of the right witness, and there would be others. He found me in the servants' passage where I slept, fragrant with wine and triumph, and he leaned in the doorway the way he'd leaned against his bought carriage 3 months earlier, with the easy confidence of a man who has never once had the floor move under him. I picked Corin myself, he said, for tomorrow. You'll like him. He has a gift for making a thing last. Father wanted to just cancel the exhibition. He thinks parading you is beneath the house now, with the Verons watching, a wide, wet smile. I convinced him otherwise. I told him the Verons should see exactly what House Ardyn does with its failures, that we cut them down in public and don't flinch. It makes us look strong. He pushed off the doorframe. So thank you, little brother. Even your humiliation is useful to me. You've always been useful that way, as the thing the rest of us look good standing next to. I want to tell you I had a cutting reply. I didn't. I just looked at my brother, golden, certain 23 years old, and utterly convinced the world was a fixed and friendly thing that would always arrange itself around his comfort. And I felt the strangest emotion, one I hadn't expected. I felt sorry for him, because I knew something he didn't. I knew that the world was not fixed. I knew that the ground could move under anyone, that the instrument could be wrong, that certainty was just a comfortable place to stand right up until it wasn't. I had learned all of that the hardest possible way, in a cold cell on the worst night of my life. And Damon was going to learn it tomorrow in front of 2,000 people, and he had no idea. And there is something genuinely sad about watching a man build a stage for his own undoing and call it your funeral. Thank you for picking Corin, I said quietly, meekly, the perfect defect. I'll do my best to make it a good show. He laughed and left, delighted, certain. And I lay awake in the dark and did not sleep, not from fear, but because I was running the bout in my head one more time. Exactly how much to reveal, exactly how to make it readable as a freak technique and not a god, exactly how to turn the stage my brother had built for my humiliation into the first stone of the thing I was going to become. He'd handed me 2,000 witnesses and called it cruelty. I intended to call it a beginning. The exhibition bout came on the third afternoon. They saved it for when the wine was flowing and the crowd was loose and cruel. A herald announced it as a demonstration of the gulf between the awakened and the unworthy. They'd actually written copy for my humiliation, and 2 guards walked me out into the practice ring in a servant's tunic, while 2,000 nobles of 2 houses settled in to enjoy themselves. Across the ring stood my opponent, a young Veron cultivator named Corin, 18, mid-core, chosen specifically because he was good enough to make it look like a fight and cruel enough to enjoy making it last. Damon had picked him. I could see my brother in the front row beside Seraphine, grinning, leaning to murmur something to her that made her not laugh. Try not to die too fast, defect, Corin said, rolling his shoulders, mana already gathering visibly around his fists. Lord Damon paid good coin for a long show. And here, finally, was the decision I'd come all this way to make. I had spent 3 months and 100 careful nights asking, does this buy me more than it costs? And almost always answering no and staying hidden. This was the first time the answer was different, and I'd known it would be since I read the letter. Because the thing about a public humiliation is that it cuts both ways. They had assembled 2,000 witnesses to watch the defect be broken. 2,000 witnesses would serve just as well to watch the defect not break. The audience my brother had gathered to crush me was, if I was careful, if I revealed just enough and no more, if I let them explain it away as a freak technique rather than a god in my blood, the exact audience I needed to begin becoming something they could no longer quietly erase. So I didn't stay hidden. For the first time, in front of everyone, I let a sliver of it off the leash. Corin came in fast and showy, a mana-wreathed fist aimed to bloody my face without quite ending things, playing to the crowd. I let it come. And a hand's breadth from my jaw, I told his momentum very quietly that it was already spent. He stopped. Not blocked, stopped, mid-lunge, as though he'd run full speed into a wall that wasn't there, his own force simply edited out of the world. The crowd's laughter stuttered. Corin staggered back, confused, and came again, harder, both fists now, real intent behind it, and I told the ground beneath his lead foot that it was ice, and told the air in his lungs that it was thin, and the great Veron cultivator went down to one knee in front of 2,000 people, gasping, having touched me exactly 0 times. I never raised a hand. That was the part that broke them. A defect who fought back with fists could be explained, dismissed, beaten eventually. But I stood perfectly still in a servant's tunic with my arms at my sides, while an awakened cultivator floundered and choked and could not reach me, and there is no story a crowd can tell itself about that except the one I wanted them to tell, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with what they'd been told about the Ardyn defect. Yield, I said to Corin quietly, just for him, and I'll let you breathe. Keep going, and I'll let everyone watch you not be able to. Your choice. I'd choose fast. He yielded. Of course, he yielded. He was 18 and drowning in open air, and he had no idea why. The silence in that arena was the single most satisfying sound of my life to that point. 2,000 nobles who had come to watch the worthless thing be broken, sitting in dead silence, recalculating. And in the front row, my brother Damon on his feet, his grin gone, his face white, not with fear yet, but with the dawning, infuriating suspicion that the joke he'd staged had just rewritten itself with him as the punchline. Beside him, Seraphine Veron was looking at me with an expression I'd seen exactly once before on a thin, precise auditor in a prosperous yard. The expression of a sharp person who has just noticed that the cheapest thing in the room might be the most valuable. And on the high seat, my father. Lord Cael Ardyn was not white-faced. He was not shocked. He was leaning forward, very slightly, with his cold eyes fixed on me and his jaw set, and I realized with a chill that my father's reaction was the most dangerous one in the entire arena. Because Lord Theron was not asking, how did the defect do that? He was asking, what is it worth, and how do I take it? I had wanted to begin becoming something they couldn't erase. I had succeeded. But I'd just taught the coldest, most acquisitive man I knew that his discarded son was an asset, and men like my father do not apologize to assets. They acquire them. I'd traded one kind of danger for a sharper one. I'd known I would. I walked out of that ring a servant still, head bowed, but the whole arena's eyes followed me, and nothing about my life was ever quietly invisible again. The hours after the bout were their own kind of battlefield, and I navigated them in my meek servant's armor, while the whole seat churned around me. Damon found me first, of course. He cornered me in a servant's corridor away from the guests, and the golden genius of House Ardyn had the wild eyes of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just cracked. "What was that?" he hissed. "What did you do to the Veron boy?" "Defects can't." The crystal said 0. 4 times. I watched. "You're nothing you've always been." He stopped, and I watched the unbearable thought arrive on his face. Unless the crystal was wrong. Unless you've been. His voice dropped to something almost frightened. "How long? How long have you been able to do that, and let us think?" "Let you think what, brother?" I asked mildly. "Let you think I was worthless." "I didn't let you think anything. You decided it when I was 16, and you enjoyed it so much you never once checked. I let that land. I poured your wine for 2 days. You looked right through me. You've been looking right through me my whole life. Don't blame me for being good at the role you cast me in." He didn't have an answer. Men like Damon never do. When the thing they've stepped on turns out to have a spine, they've built their whole selves on the stepping, and they have no script for the day the ground pushes back. He left, white and silent, and I knew I'd made an enemy who'd spend the rest of the gathering whispering poison about me into every ear that mattered. Good. Let him. A man frantically warning everyone that the defect is dangerous is as a man teaching the whole court to take the defect seriously. Seraphine Veron found me second, which I had not expected. She came to the servants' court herself, unescorted, which a noblewoman of her rank simply did not do, and she looked at me with that cold, patient, assessing gaze and said, without preamble, "My father's negotiators have spent 3 days telling me how fortunate I am to marry into House Ardyn. And today their family defect, the one they paraded out as a joke, made a Veron cultivator kneel without lifting a finger." A thin, precise smile. "I find I'm less interested in the strength of this house than in the things it throws away. That seems to be where the real power is hiding." She studied me. "What are you, exactly?" "Underestimated," I said. "Which is the most useful thing a person can be, my lady." "You'd know." "They parade you out too, don't they? Prize in someone else's transaction. Measured for your usefulness to a house. Never once asked what you'd choose." I watched that land in her the way truth always lands in the people who've been waiting their whole lives to hear it. We're more alike than either of our houses would like, I think. Remember that. It may matter sooner than you expect. I didn't know yet exactly how I'd use what I'd just planted. But I'd learned, pouring wine, that Seraphine Veron was a sharp, unhappy woman in a cage of other people's making. And a sharp, unhappy person who's just been seen clearly is the most powerful ally in the world, if you have the patience to wait for the moment they're ready to act. I filed her away beside everything else, and I went to find a dark corner to think, because the day had gone exactly as I'd planned and far better than I'd hoped, and the only thing left to manage was the cost of having been, for the first time, truly seen. The scholar found me that night, which told me she'd been watching the arena for exactly what she'd just seen. I'd retreated to the servants' court to think, and she came out of the dark in a travel-stained gray robe. Not Ardyn livery, not Veron, something older and plainer, and she said, without preamble, in a low, fast voice, "You shouldn't have done that." They felt it. Not your house, they're too blind. The church. The moment you bent the truth of the world in front of witnesses, every ashen reliquary within 100 miles rang like a struck bell. They're already moving. You have days, not weeks. And you are? Someone who left them. She pushed back her hood, an ordinary woman, perhaps 40, with the burned scar of a removed brand on her wrist where a holy symbol used to be. My name is Ines. I was a scholar of the Ashen Church for 19 years, until I read the one book they keep that tells the truth, and couldn't stay. She looked at me with something between awe and grief. You don't know what you are. I watched your face out there. You think it's a strange technique. A trick. It isn't. Boy, what's in your blood is the thing my entire former order exists to erase. You carry the bloodline of a forgotten god. And there, in a cold servant's court, Ines told me the truth that reframed my whole life. The truth old Brand's grandmother had only half remembered. There had been, she said, older gods once. Not the abstract distant powers the church now preached, but present things woven into the world, and the greatest of them had been a god with no name the church would let survive, a god whose domain was not fire or storm or war, but truth itself, the god of what things truly are. 3 centuries ago, the order that would become the Ashen Church had decided that a god who could unmake their lies was intolerable. So they killed it. Not in a battle, gods don't die in battles. They killed it the way you erase a word. They hunted down everyone who carried its bloodline, every priest, every descendant, every child, across 2 generations, until there was no one left to remember the god, and then they wrote it out of every history, and called the silence holiness. The Ashen Church's true purpose beneath the sermons was simply this: to make sure the murdered god stayed dead, to hunt the bloodline forever in case it ever woke. And it has, Ines whispered, in you. After 300 years. I don't know how, some thread they missed, some discarded line they didn't think worth chasing. A concubine, I said, very quietly, and the whole shape of my mother's life rearranged itself in front of me. A low-born singer, of no account, beneath the church's notice. The wrong instrument. She'd known. Not all of it, maybe, but enough to tell a 6-year-old to remember, and then to die poor and forgotten and unhunted, carrying the last ember of a murdered god in a body no one thought worth measuring. My mother carried it. And being nothing is exactly what kept it alive. Being nothing kept you alive, Ines said. Being something will get you killed, unless you get strong enough, fast enough, to be the first carrier in 300 years the church can't quietly erase. They erased the god, Cael. They will not lose sleep over a servant. I sat with that for a long moment in the cold. A murdered god. A church 3 centuries deep, built to keep it murdered. A bloodline that survived only because the world had been so certain my mother and I were worthless that no one ever thought to check. I should have been afraid. I just learned that the most powerful religious order on the continent was, even now, sending its hunters north to erase me. Instead, I felt the strange, clean clarity again, the clarity of a man whose enemies have just, finally, come into focus. Because I understood something Ines didn't. Something my whole miserable life had trained me to see. The church and my father were the same disease. Both of them ruled by deciding what was worthless and what was not. Both of them erased what they couldn't measure or control. The church had murdered a God of truth because truth threatened their lies, and my father had thrown away a son because a crystal threatened his pride, and the only real difference between them was scale. And I, the discarded son of a discarded woman carrying a discarded God, was, I realized, the single thing in the world built precisely to be the answer to both of them. Tell me everything, I said to Enos. Every weakness, every name. Where the church hunts from, who leads it, what it fears. I rose, and for the first time I didn't bother bowing my head, didn't bother with the meek armor, because the time for hiding from at least one of my enemies was over. They're coming north to erase Hollowmere to get to me. 40 people who were kind to a nothing when no one else was. I felt the God turn over in my blood, no longer patient, finally awake. I'm not going to let them. I'm going to be ready. And then I'm going to give a 300-year-old church the one thing it has spent 3 centuries making sure could never happen. Which is a witness, I said. The God they murdered, standing in the light, remembered. Let's go home, Enos. I have a great deal of growing to do and not much time, and a church that's about to learn what it actually feels like to meet the thing you've spent your whole life pretending isn't real. I rode north that night, a servant slipping away from a tournament, leaving behind 2,000 recalculating nobles, a white-faced brother, a father already scheming to acquire me, and a betrothal quietly coming apart at its seams. Behind me, the trap of my old life. Ahead of me, Hollowmere and Lyra, and the hunters already on the road. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from anything. I was running toward the fight. I had 11 days between the tournament and the church, and I spent every one of them turning a dying estate into something that could survive what was coming. Not a fortress of walls. Hollowmere had no walls worth the name, and I had no time to build them. A fortress of people. Eanes mapped everything she knew of how the Ashen Church hunted. Their inquisitors moved in cells of 6, led by a brand-bearer who could sense the bloodline. They came quietly first, to confirm, then loudly, to erase, and they relied, above all, on the certainty that their target would be alone and afraid, because in 3 centuries that had always been true. The carriers they'd hunted had always been isolated heretics, lone descendants with no one to stand with them. That's the weakness, I told Ines and old Bran and Lyra, the 3 of them gathered in the lamplight of the steward's old office, which I had quietly made my own. 300 years of hunting people who stood alone has taught them to expect someone alone. They have no doctrine for a carrier who spent a season earning 40 people's loyalty. They're going to walk into Hollowmere expecting a frightened heretic and a flock of strangers who'll scatter. I looked at the 3 faces in the lamplight, the defected scholar, the one-eyed veteran, the servant who'd been kind to nothing. I don't intend to give them that. I trained the estate folk, not in cultivation, which they'd never have, but in the only things that win a fight against people who expect you to break, where to stand, when to hold, how not to scatter. Bran, who'd soldiered in a forgotten war, drilled them. Enis taught me the church's reliquary craft, the limits of a brand-bearer's senses, how the hunters thought. And in the bog at night, harder than ever, I pushed the God in my blood up its endless slope, because the arithmetic had changed completely. For the first time, the question wasn't, does this buy me more than it costs? It was simply, how strong can I get before they arrive? And the answer needed to be very. The training of the 40 was the part I hadn't expected to change me. I thought of it at first coldly, assets to be positioned, a wall of bodies to make the church hesitate. But you cannot drill beside people for 11 days, cannot watch a lame farmer named Toller practice, holding a line with a borrowed spear and a jaw set against his own fear, cannot see a washerwoman learn where to stand so the wounded can be pulled back behind her, without it becoming something other than tactics. These were people the world had measured at 0, every one of them, too poor, too broken, too old, too low to matter to any house. And here they were, choosing to learn how to stand against a God-killing church, not because they had power, but because for the first time in their lives, someone had told them they were worth defending and then proved it. I had spent the season giving them their lives back one quiet miracle at a time. Now they were lining up to risk those lives for the man who'd done it, and the math of that, the sheer unreasonable generosity of it, undid something in me that all my father's cruelty never had. "You keep looking at them like you don't understand it," Lyra said one evening, finding me watching Bran drill the line in the last light. The loyalty. "You look at it the way a starving man looks at a full table, like there's a trick." "In my family, there was always a trick," I said. "Loyalty was a transaction. You were worth what you could do for the house, and the moment you were worth less, you were gone. I keep waiting for these people to do the sum and realize I'm not worth dying for." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "That's the difference between you and the house, Cael. Theron made people serve him by making them afraid of what he'd take. You made people love you by giving them back what everyone else took. Fear runs out the moment you're not the biggest thing in the room. But the other thing," she nodded at the 40, at Toller, at Bran, at the lit windows of a town that had been a tomb a season ago, "that doesn't run out. That's the whole reason the church is going to lose, and they don't even know it yet. They've spent 300 years learning to break people who stand alone. They never learned what to do with people who won't." I looked at her in the last light, this woman who'd been kind to nothing, who saw the shape of things faster than I did, who'd just explained my own war to me better than I could have. And I understood that whatever I was building, whatever the god in my blood became, the most important thing I'd found in the bog wasn't the power. It was her and Bran and 40 people who taught a discarded son that worth was never a number on a crystal. It was who stood beside you when the fire came. Ines, watching from the doorway, gave me a thin, knowing smile, as though she could see the exact moment a weapon became a man with something to protect. "Then we'd better make sure they're ready," I said. "All of them. Because the thing coming north has never lost, and it has never once met what we are. Vargas tried to sell us out, of course. I'd expected it. A small, cruel man who's lost his power will always reach for whoever's bigger, and when the first Ashen cell came quietly into the village to confirm the rumor, 3 days early, in the gray robes of pilgrims, Steward Vargas went straight to them and offered, for coin and his own safety, to point out the heretic. He pointed at me. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it matters for everything that came after. I did not hate Vargas. Hating Vargas would have been like hating the weather. He was simply what cruelty makes when you give it a little power and no one to answer to. The same thing my father was, scaled down to a steward's crop. What I felt watching him sell me to the Inquisitors with that soft, eager face was the cold clarity and the decision. I let them take me. The brand bearer leading the cell, a gaunt woman with the Ashen sigil burned deep into her palm, laid her hand on my chest in the village square to confirm the bloodline, and her face changed from professional certainty to something I'd been hoping to see. Fear. Real fear. Because 300 years of hunting frightened lone heretics had not prepared her for what she felt under her hand, which was not a guttering ember of a murdered god but a slope, a thing that had been growing in silence for a season, that was. I felt it through her touch, felt her feel it, already far past anything in her doctrine. "This isn't a remnant," she breathed. "This is awake. Burn it now, burn the whole village before it." "You came expecting someone alone," I said. And I looked past her at the village square where the people of Hollowmere had quietly come out of every doorway, not scattering, not cowering, but standing, 40 of them, with Bran at the front and Lyra beside him, and old Toller, whose back I'd healed, gripping a pitchfork, all of them placing themselves, deliberately, between the Inquisitors and the man who'd given them their lives back. "You spent 3 centuries hunting people no one would stand for. Look around, sister. Look at what you actually walked into." The brand bearer looked, and I watched the second weakness of the Ashen Church bloom in front of me. An order built entirely on the certainty that its prey is alone and unloved has no idea what to do when the prey is neither. Then they tried to burn us, and I stopped hiding. I won't pretend it was effortless. 6 Ashen Inquisitors, holy fire and reliquary words, and I was still new to the full weight of what I carried. But I had the slope, and I had 11 days of nothing but preparation, and I had, and this was the thing that decided it, 40 people behind me whom I would not let burn. The holy fire came, and I told it was already out. The brand bearer's wards flared, and I told them they were broken. An inquisitor's blade found Toller's son, and I told the wound it had never happened, and it hadn't. I moved through that fight not as a warrior, but as an argument the world could not refute, editing their violence out of existence faster than they could commit it, and at the center of it I felt the God in my blood fully awake for the first time. Not patient anymore, almost joyful. There you are, doing the thing I was made for, telling a lie that it is not the truth. When it was over, 5 inquisitors were unconscious and bound, the brand bearer was on her knees, and not one soul of Hollowmere had died. And Vargas, who had hidden behind the church's robes, expecting to watch me burn, was standing alone in the middle of the square with the dawning understanding of a man who has bet everything on the wrong horse. I didn't kill him. The songs would be cleaner if I had, but I've never had much use for clean. I told the people of Hollowmere what he'd done, the selling, the pointing, the coin, and I let them decide, because the estate was theirs now more than it was the house's, and a man who'd ruled them by fear deserved to learn what their judgment unforced actually weighed. They didn't kill him either. They stripped him of his post and his stores, and walked him to the road and told him to go find a place that didn't know him, which for a man like Vargas, whose entire self was the small power he held over others, was a worse sentence than the bog. The last I saw of my first tyrant, he was a soft shape trudging south into a world that had stopped being afraid of him. I felt nothing. That, I've come to think, is its own kind of victory, to reach the man who tormented you and find that he no longer occupies any space in you at all. The brand bearer I kept. And from her, with Inez's help, I learned the thing that turned the whole war, that the Ashen Church's reliquaries had rung at the tournament, yes, which meant the church now knew the bloodline had woken near House Ardyn, and that the Archon himself, Malith, the head of the order, a man 3 centuries of fanaticism had made into something barely human, was already coming north in person, because in 300 years no carrier had ever grown strong enough to require the Archon's personal attention, and Malith would not delegate the death of a god twice. I had perhaps a month before the church arrived in force. But the church, it turned out, did not wait the full month. It sent a knife ahead of the army to test the edge of what was coming. Her name was Inquisitor Sarah Coldwater, and she was nothing like the first cell. The first cell had come expecting a frightened heretic. Coldwater came expecting me. The church had felt the strength of what I'd done to her brand-bearer, and they'd sent a senior inquisitor with a full hand of brand-bearers and a cold professional intelligence that the fanatics lacked. Not to erase me, not yet, but to measure me, the way my whole life had been measured, so the Archon would know exactly what he was marching toward. She didn't attack the estate. She was smarter than that. She took 3 of the outlying tenant families hostage, the Pells, who farmed the eastern fields, including their grown sons, and sent word that she'd burn them at dawn unless the heretic came alone to a crossroads to be examined. It was a good trap. It was built on the same assumption every enemy I'd ever had built their plans on, that a discarded thing like me, faced with the choice between my own safety and the lives of people who were technically nothing to me, would choose myself the way the powerful always chose themselves. I went to the crossroads, but I did not go alone, and I did not go as prey. I'd learned by then the difference between hiding my power and hoarding it, and against Coldwater I spent it like a man who knew exactly what each coin bought. She had her brand-bearers ring the crossroads, expecting to pin and study a lone heretic. Instead, I told the iron of their shackles, where they held the Pell family, that it had rusted to powder 3 years ago, and it had. I told the holy wards Coldwater raised that they had been drawn wrong by a careless hand, and they failed. And when she came at me herself, with the cold, competent fury of a professional whose plan was dissolving, I did not unmake her. I did something that frightened the church far more, because Coldwater lived to report it. I told her certainty that it was doubt. That's the thing the God of truth could do that no fire ever could. I looked at a woman who had spent her life utterly sure she served holiness, and I made her feel, for one unbearable moment, the truth she'd spent 30 years not looking, that she'd burned people for carrying the blood of something good. She broke. Not her body, her certainty. She called off the brand bearers, freed the Pels with her own shaking hands, and fled north to the Archon, not with a measurement of my power, but with a wound in her faith, which I had come to understand was the only kind of wound that actually mattered against the Ashen Church. You let her go, Ines said after, half horror, half awe. She'll tell Malith everything. She'll tell Malith that I didn't kill her when I could have, that I freed the hostages she'd taken, and that for one moment she doubted 300 years of her own faith. I said, let her carry that into his army. Doubt is the one disease his penitents have no ward against. I just sent the Archon a plague disguised as a survivor. I watched the road north where Coldwater had fled. Every enemy I've ever beaten, I've beaten the same way, Ines. Not by being stronger, by making them carry the truth home themselves. And that was exactly when my father decided to acquire me. Lord Theron came to Hollowmere himself, which told me how the tournament had rattled the house, because Cael Ardyn did not travel to dying estates. He came with Daemon and a column of house guards, and the cold confident air of a man arriving to repossess his property. He found, instead of a broken servant, an estate that bowed to no one, a defected church scholar at my side, and a son who met him in the prosperous yard without bowing his head. So, my father said, taking in the full barns, the healthy people, the way they stood. The rumors were true. You've awakened something after all. Something the crystal couldn't read. His cold eyes assessed me the way the auditors had, the way they assessed everything, for value, for use. This changes matters, Cael. The house was hasty. A son with your gift has a place with us after all. The Veron alliance wavers. A demonstration of ardent power at the right moment would secure it. Come home. Take your name back. Serve the house as you were always meant to. And there it was. Not I was wrong. Not I'm sorry I threw away your mother and then you. Just the cold arithmetic of a man who had decided I was now an asset, offering to undiscard me the moment I became useful, expecting gratitude. 3 months earlier, some small starved part of me would have wept to hear my father offer me a place. I checked, standing in that yard. That part was gone. The bog had taken it, or the god had, or Lyra had, and I did not miss it. No, I said. Damon laughed, the old reflex. You don't say no to Father Defect. You don't have a house, a name, or a. I have 40 people who'd stand in front of holy fire for me, I said, which is 40 more than either of you has ever had. I have a power your crystal can't measure and your house can't control. And I have something you want very badly, Father, which means for once in my life, I'm the one who sets the terms. I let that land. So here are mine. I keep Hollowmere, outright deeded, free of the house. The people here are mine to protect, not yours to spend. And I will not be a sword you point at the Verons to prop up a marriage they're already trying to escape. Theron's eyes narrowed. The Verons are committed. The Verons are stalling, I said, while Lord Veron waits for a better offer, which he expects within the season. Seraphine looks at Damon like a debt she's been forced to assume. You've staked the future of this house on an alliance the other side is quietly planning to break the moment something shinier comes along, and you'd burn your own son's new power to hold it together a little longer. I watched the certainty flicker in his cold eyes, watched him realize I'd learned more pouring his wine than he'd learned sitting on his high seat. I learned that serving at your table, Father. Funny what people say in front of the help. You really should pay more attention to the things you've decided are beneath your notice. It's a recurring weakness in this family. I had not come back to House Ardyn to take a place at its table. I had come to break the thing it was built on, the lie that worth flowed only one direction, from the measured to the unmeasured, from the named to the discarded. So I did the thing that ended the alliance and my father's grip in a single afternoon, and I did it not with the God in my blood, but with the truth I'd hoarded, which has always been the sharper weapon. I sent Seraphine Veron a letter, not a threat, an offer of honesty. I laid out, plainly, what I'd seen, that her father meant to break the betrothal the instant a better house came courting, that she was being kept in a transaction no one had asked her to want, and that I, who had every reason to want House Arden humbled, was giving her this freely because I'd spent my whole life being something powerful people spent without consent, and I'd decided to stop helping them do it to anyone else. Seraphine Veron, it turned out, was a great deal like me, a sharp person the powerful had mistaken for a possession. She took my letter to her father, and then when he confirmed it with the particular fury of a man caught, she did something far braver than I'd asked. She took it public, at the betrothal council itself. I wasn't in the hall. A discarded servant doesn't get invited to watch two houses negotiate a merger. But I had it from a dozen mouths after, the way you always get the best stories, and they all agreed on the shape of it. The council had gathered, both lords, their advisers, the cream of two houses, my father at the head of the Arden delegation, wearing the tight, confident smile of a man about to secure his family's future. And Seraphine Veron had risen, when she was meant to sit silent and decorative, and she had laid the whole thing bare, that her father intended to break the betrothal the moment a greater house came courting, that he'd been stringing House Arden along for the prestige, while he shopped for better, that the entire alliance my father had staked his house's future on was a thing the other side had never meant to honor. She'd named dates. She'd named the rival houses her father was quietly courting. She'd done, in a noble council, the single most dangerous thing in that whole gilded world. She'd told the truth out loud, in a room built entirely on not doing that. The hall, by every account, came apart. Lord Veron, exposed, lost his composure, and confirmed half of it in his own furious denials, which is what guilty men always do. My father, blindsided, realized in front of everyone that he'd bet his house on a lie, and worse, that a Veron daughter had known it and chosen to detonate it rather than marry his son. And Damon, Golden Damon, sat at that table and watched the alliance that was supposed to crown him dissolve into the most public humiliation either house had suffered in a generation. I'd handed Seraphine a blade, but she was the one who'd had the nerve to use it in the one room where using it cost the most, because she'd spent her whole life being measured for her usefulness to a house, and a person who's been a possession long enough will, given one real chance, burn the whole auction down. I understood her perfectly. I'd have done the same. I had done the same in a practice ring in front of 2,000 people a few days before. The alliance collapsed in a single day. House Veron, exposed as bad faith schemers, lost their standing. House Arden, revealed as desperate enough to be strung along, lost the future it had staked everything on. And Damon, Golden Damon, whose entire worth had been wrapped up in the marriage that would lift the house, stood in the wreckage of his betrothal as exactly what he'd spent his life mocking me for being, a son who had failed to be what the house needed. "You did this," he said to me, white and shaking, when it was done. You nothing." "I didn't do anything, Damon," I said almost gently, because there was no joy left in it for me, only the closing of an old account. "I just told the truth to someone who needed to hear it. That's all I've ever done, really." It's astonishing how much damage the truth does to people who've built everything on a lie. I looked at my brother, the genius, the golden one, the thumb that had pressed into every wound of my childhood. "You measured me at zero my whole life. You should have asked what instrument you were using." My father did not rage. That was the most telling thing. Lord Theron Arden looked at the wreckage of his ambitions and at the son he'd discarded who'd caused it, and his cold mind did the only thing it knew how to do. It recalculated, and it began, I could see, to plan. He left Hollowmere that day with his grip on me broken and his house diminished, and I knew it wasn't over between us, because men like my father don't end. They regroup. But I had bigger things coming north than my father's wounded pride, because the brand bearer had told the truth. A week after the Varans fell, Ines came to me in the grey dawn with her face the color of ash, holding a reliquary fragment that had gone cold and silent in a way she said meant only one thing. "He's close," she said. "The Archon. Malith himself. He's stopped sending hunters." She looked at me, and at the estate full of people I'd promised to protect, and at the bog where I'd grown a murdered god back to life. "He's coming to do it personally, Cael, the way they did it 300 years ago. He's coming to erase you and everyone who ever stood with you and the god in your blood, all of it, so the silence holds for another 3 centuries." I looked north, into the cold, toward the thing my whole life had been building toward without my knowing it. "Good," I said, and I meant it. Let him come close. It's always the same trick, Ines. With my father, with the church, with all of them. The god turned over in my blood, fully awake now, no longer hiding, ready. They get so certain you're nothing that they walk all the way up to you to do the erasing themselves. And that's the one moment they're finally close enough to learn the truth. Archon Malith did not come north quietly, and that was the first thing he taught me about himself, that after 300 years of the church hunting in silence, its master had decided this one was worth doing loud. He came with an army. Not soldiers. The Ashen Church had no soldiers properly. He came with penitents, hundreds of gray-robed zealots who'd burned away their own names and fears in the church's fire, each one carrying a fragment of the reliquary craft, who felt neither pain nor doubt and could not be reasoned with because there was no longer anyone inside to reason with. And he came with the brand-bearers, dozens of them, and at their head he came himself. And when Ines saw the Archon for the first time through a spyglass from the Hollowmere watchtower, she put the glass down with a shaking hand and said, very quietly, "That's not a man anymore." 300 years of holding a god dead does something to whatever's doing the holding. Don't look at him and expect to find a person, Cael. There's nothing in there but the murder. I looked anyway. You should always look at the thing that's come to erase you. Malith was tall and gray and burned-looking, like a candle that had melted and reset wrong. And even at that distance I could feel him the way the brand-bearer had felt me. A vast cold absence, a hole in the truth of the world shaped exactly like a god-shaped wound that had never healed because he'd spent 3 centuries keeping it open on purpose. And he was not only coming for me. That was the part that changed everything. The church did not make distinctions. To erase a bloodline 300 years ago, they had erased everyone near it, every witness, every neighbor, every soul who might carry a memory. Malith's host swept north in a widening grey tide, and it did not march around House Ardyn on its way to Hollowmere. It marched through. Because the god had woken near the Ardyn seat, and so the Ardyn seat and everyone in it was now part of the silence that had to hold. My father's messenger reached Hollowmere half dead on a foundered horse, carrying a letter in Lord Theron's cramped hand, and the letter was the second masterpiece of my father's life, but a different kind than the first. The first letter, the exile, had been cruelty wearing the mask of law. This one was terror wearing the mask of command. "The church is upon us," it said. "They will not negotiate. They say the heresy began with you and will end with all who sheltered or sired it. House Ardyn burns because of what you are. Return and surrender yourself to the Archon, and perhaps he will spare the house that cast you out. It is the least you owe the family that raised you." I read it aloud to Ines and Bran and Lyra in the lamplight, and when I finished there was a silence, and then Bran spat into the fire and said what they were all thinking. "The family that raised you. The gall of the man. Threw you in a bog and now sends a bill for the privilege. He's not wrong that the house burns because of me," I said. "He's not right that you owe them for it," Lyra said, sharp, and I looked at her and her jaw was set in the way I'd come to love. "Cael, listen to me. That man branded you defective in front of 2,000 people. He threw your mother away and then threw you away, and he'd throw you away again tomorrow if a crystal told him to. Don't you dare walk into that church's fire because Theron Ardyn finally found a use for your death. I'm not going to surrender to Malith, I said. That's exactly what he wants. The carrier, alone, frightened, walking willingly to the fire the way 300 years of carriers did. It's the oldest trick the church has. They make you believe surrendering will save the people you love, and then they erase you and the people both, because erasing the people was always the point. I set the letter down, but I'm also not going to let House Ardyn burn. Ines stared at me. After everything they did to you. Why? And here was the thing I'd come to understand, the thing that separated me from my father and from Malith both. Because the whole disease, I said, the thing wrong with my father and wrong with the church and wrong with this entire world is the idea that some people are worth saving and some are worth erasing, and that you get to decide which by measuring them with your instrument. The church measures with fire. My father measures with a crystal. They're the same sickness. I looked at the four faces in the lamplight, my whole strange family. If I let House Ardyn burn because they wronged me, then I've just picked up the instrument. I've just decided some people are worth erasing. I won't. Not even them. Especially not them, because saving the people who threw me away is the only way to prove, to them and to me, that their whole measure was wrong. It wasn't mercy, exactly. It was something harder and cleaner. It was refusing all the way down to become the thing that made me. So we marched south to meet a church at the seat of the house that had exiled me, and I went not to surrender, but to defend the people who discarded me from the people who wanted to erase us all, which is, I'm aware, an absurd thing to do, and I'd do it again. The battle for the Ardyn seat lasted from dusk to dawn, and it nearly broke me. I'd grown strong in the bog. The slope had climbed higher than I dared hope. But strength against 6 inquisitors in a village is a different thing than strength against the Archon's full host, and the first hours taught me my limits hard. There were too many of them. The penitents did not stop, did not flinch, did not fear. I'd edit one out of a charge and 3 more would step over him, and I learned that a power over truth is still bounded by the truth of one tired body that can only argue with the world so many times before it begins to fray. The battle came in waves, each one teaching me a different limit. The first wave was penitents alone, and I held them at the outer wall almost easily, telling their fire it was cold and their courage it was spent, until I realized the courage wouldn't spend, because there was nothing left in them to frighten, and an enemy with no fear to argue with is an enemy you can only stop one body at a time. The second wave brought the brand bearers, and they were worse, because they could feel what I was doing and brace against it. Every truth I told the world, they tried to tell back, and the air over the Ardyn court became a war of competing realities, the stone flickering between whole and broken as a dozen wills argued over what was true. I won those arguments. I had a god, and they had only fragments, but winning cost, and I felt the slope I'd climbed all season being spent faster than I could have imagined, like a fortune that had taken months to earn and was going in a single night. And the third wave was the one that nearly ended it. They stopped trying to kill me and started trying to kill the people behind me, because they'd understood, with the cold cleverness of the senior inquisitors, that the heretic could be unmade not by force but by grief. They came for my 40. They came for Lyra. And I learned the cruelest limit of a power that could save anyone, that it could not save everyone at once, that every wound I told to vanish was a heartbeat I wasn't spending on the next one, that to be able to save any single person is to be forced, in a battle, to choose which ones, over and over, faster than your heart can break. I have commanded since. I have won larger fights. I have never again been as afraid as I was in those gray hours, holding a line that kept fraying, doing arithmetic with lives, feeling the God in my blood and the limits of my body pull in opposite directions, while the people who trusted me died in the spaces I couldn't reach in time. Holy fire fell on the Ardyn walls. Brand bearers tore at the protections I raised. And my 40, the people of Hollowmere who'd come south with me, stood in the breach beside the very Ardyn guards who'd once watched me dragged from that same great hall in chains, a bitter and beautiful irony I had no time to savor. Some of them died. I felt everyone, because I could not be everywhere, could not tell every wound that it had never happened, and that is the cruelest limit of all, to be able to save anyone, and therefore to have to choose which. There was a moment, 3 hours into the battle, that I will carry for the rest of my life. The penitents had breached the outer court, and a knot of them broke through toward the infirmary, where Holomir's wounded lay, toward Toller, who'd taken a blade in the thigh holding the gate, and the others too hurt to run. I was 40 paces away with a wall of holy fire between us, already stretched past anything I'd done, and I felt the cold, sick certainty that I could not reach them in time, that the limit of me was about to cost the lives of the people who'd trusted me most. And in that moment old Bran, one-eyed, 60 years old, a soldier from a war the world had forgotten, stepped into the infirmary doorway alone with a spear and planted himself there, and held, buying the seconds I needed, the way he'd told me he wanted to live long enough to see the looking start again. I reached them. I told the holy fire it had never been lit, and I told the penitents' blades they were made of nothing, and I got there in time, for the wounded, for Toller, for all of them but Bran. He'd taken the wound that bought the seconds, and even the god in my blood has a rule I learned that night and have hated ever since. I can tell a wound it never happened, but only if I reach it before the truth of it sets. I reached Bran a heartbeat, too late, and the truth had already closed over him, and the world would not let me argue it back. He looked up at me with his one eye as I knelt over him, and he was, impossibly, smiling. "The looking started, hasn't it?" he said. "I can feel it. 300 years of nobody looking, and now," he gripped my arm, "don't you dare grieve me in the middle of a fight, boy. Win it. Grieve me after. That's an order from a man who soldiered before your father was born." And then the oldest of my loyalties, the second person at Hollowmere to choose me, was gone, and I knelt in the ash for exactly 3 seconds, and then I stood up and I did what he ordered, because the only thing worse than losing him would have been wasting what he bought. I have built monuments since. The first thing I raised at Hollowmere, before the walls, before anything, was a stone for Bran, with the old unlucky word his grandmother used carved into it, spoken aloud now without fear. The looking had started. He'd paid for the first of it. I have never let myself forget the price. Lyra fought beside me the whole night. I'd told her to stay north, in safety, and she'd looked at me with those unbroken eyes and said, "You don't get to be the only one who refuses to stand in the crowd," and that was the end of the argument. She had no power but her nerve, and her nerve was considerable, and she pulled the wounded out of the fire while I held the line, and a dozen times that night the sight of her in the chaos was the only thing that kept me arguing with the world. And somewhere in the gray hours, my father fought too. That surprised me. I'd half expected Lord Theron to barricade himself in the keep and let the rest of us burn as his shield. Instead, he was on the wall with his guards, an old cold man wielding a cultivator's mana with grim competence, defending his house. And when our lines were driven back to the inner court and we ended up, for a moment, fighting back to back amid the holy fire, he looked at me across the chaos with an expression I'd never once seen on his face in 20 years. Confusion. The pure confusion of a man whose instrument has just given him a reading he cannot explain. He'd measured me at 0. He'd thrown me away as worthless. And here was the worthless thing, holding the line that kept his house alive, the only force on that wall the church actually feared. "Why," he said, between one wave and the next, panting ash on his gray furs, "why are you defending us? After what Later, father," I said. "Try to survive the night and I'll explain my entire philosophy. Right now, mind the left." But the night was turning against us, and we both knew it. For every penitent I unmade, the gray tide pressed closer. My power was fraying at the edges. I'd been arguing with the world for 9 hours, and the world was getting harder to convince. And then, near dawn, Archon Malith finally walked onto the field himself, and the temperature of the whole battle dropped, because the thing Enos had warned me about turned out to be worse than she'd said. Where Malith walked, my power simply stopped. He was a god-shaped wound, 3 centuries of murdered divinity held open, and being near him was like trying to speak in a room that ate sound. I told the penitent's blade it had missed, and for the first time it didn't listen. Malith's presence smothered the truth I was trying to tell. I learned, in those first terrible seconds of his approach, why no carrier in 300 years had ever survived the Archon's personal attention, and why Enos had put down the spyglass with a shaking hand. It was not that Malith was strong, the way a cultivator is strong. It was that he was an absence so total that the God in my blood, which worked by telling the world what was true, simply had nothing to push against near him. He had spent 3 centuries unmaking a God of truth. He had become, in the process, a place where truth itself went quiet. The closer he came, the more I felt myself reduced to what the crystal had always said I was. Nothing, zero, a defect with no core, because his presence was the lie my whole family had told me, made manifest and walking, the living embodiment of every instrument that had ever measured me and found me empty. And the worst part, the part I have never told anyone but Lyra, is that for a few seconds I believed him. Standing in that smothering absence with my power guttering and my people dying and the oldest of my certainties rising up to meet the oldest of my wounds, I felt the 20 years of being told I was worthless reach up and shake hands with 300 years of a church's silence. And together they whispered the thing I'd spent my whole life almost believing, that the instrument had been right, that I was the zero. That my mother's 7 words had been a poor woman's desperate lie to comfort a doomed child, and the crystal and the Archon and my father had all simply been telling me the truth. That, I understand now, is the real weapon of every certainty that ever ruled the world. Not its strength. Its contagion. The way a powerful enough lie can get inside the very person it's lying about and make them carry it for free. Malith crossed the court toward me through my own faltering power as though it were mist, and the penitents fell back to give their master room, and he looked at me with eyes like 2 more burned-out holes, and spoke in a voice that had not been used for kindness in a very long time. 300 years, Malith said, I have kept the silence. Do you know what it costs, boy, to hold a god dead? To be the wall against which the world's most dangerous truth has thrown itself every day for 3 centuries? He raised a gray hand, and I felt the wound of him widen, felt my power guttering like the candle on my worst night. It costs everything. It cost me my name, my fear, myself. I am nothing now but the holding. And you would undo 300 years of my emptiness for what? A handful of servants. A father who hates you. You are a child who has mistaken a borrowed god for a self. He was close now, close enough to erase me, close enough that my power had nearly gone dark, and Lyra was somewhere behind me in the smoke, and my 40 were dying in the court, and my father was watching, and for one terrible moment I felt the old measure settle over me, the old certainty, 300 years and 20 years deep, that I was nothing, that the instrument had been right all along, that the wound of Malith would simply edit me out of the world the way the church had edited out my God. And then I understood the trick. The same trick. The only trick. He had come close to erase me himself. He was, right now, standing closer to me than any enemy I'd ever had. The Archon, the head of the church, 3 centuries of murder, leaning all the way in to do the erasing personally, exactly as my father had leaned in at the tournament, exactly as everyone always did, because they were so certain I was nothing that they walked right up to me to confirm it. And I had spent my entire life learning the one thing that the certain never learn until it's too late. You're right, I said to Malith, with my power nearly dark and his wound an inch from swallowing me whole. I am a child who mistook a borrowed god for a self. The gray hand reached for my chest. Behind me, Lyra screamed my name. But here's what 300 years of holding the silence never taught you, Archon. The god isn't borrowed. I stopped trying to argue with the world around him, and I started arguing with him. It's mine, I said, and I reached past everything I'd learned, past the slope, past the technique, past the careful patient hiding. And I told the one truth I had never said aloud, the truth my mother died protecting, the truth the whole church existed to keep silent. I told the God in my blood that it was awake, not a remnant, not an ember, not a borrowed trick. Awake, home, mine. And the murdered God of truth, after 300 years of silence, finally answered its own name. The dawn broke at exactly the wrong moment for Archon Malith, which is the kind of thing that only happens in songs and, apparently, in my life. The first grey light coming over the Ardyn walls just as the wound in front of me recoiled, just as the thing in my blood stopped being a power I used and became, for one blazing instant, a presence I carried, vast and patient and finally awake. Malith staggered back. For the first time, the God-shaped hole in the world looked, of all things, afraid. That's not possible, he breathed. The carrier can't. The bloodline is a remnant. It can't fully. You spent 300 years making sure no carrier ever lived long enough, or loved enough, or grew strong enough to wake it all the way, I said, and my voice didn't sound entirely like my own anymore. You hunted us alone and frightened and young. You never once let one of us get a season in a bog, and a one-eyed man's stories, and 40 people who'd stand in fire, and a woman who'd refuse to let him walk into yours. Behind me, I felt Lyra alive. Around me, I felt my 40 and even the Ardyn guards, and my father, all of them still standing because I'd held the line long enough for the sun to rise. You made one mistake, Archon, the same mistake my father made, the same mistake everyone makes. You were so certain I was nothing that you came close enough to find out. The sun cleared the wall. My power came back not as a trickle but as a flood. The smothering wound of Malith suddenly unable to hold against a god that was no longer dead, that was standing in the light in me, remembered. And Archon Malith, 300 years of murder, master of the Ashen Church, looked at the thing he had come to North erase, and understood that he had walked all the way up to the one carrier in 3 centuries who was finally, fully awake, and that the silence he'd given everything to hold was about to break in his hands. It can't end like this, he whispered. 300 years. It can't. It's not going to end, I said. That's the whole point. You can't erase a truth that's decided to be remembered. You can only walk up close to it and find out. The god rose in me, patient no longer, and the dawn was everywhere, and the long night was over, and the reckoning I'd been growing toward since a cold cell on the worst night of my life had finally fully arrived. Now, let me show you what you actually came north to meet. I did not kill Archon Malith. I want that on the record because every song since has gotten it wrong, and the truth of how it actually ended is the only part of this whole story that I think matters more than the rest. You cannot kill a man like Malith by force. 3 centuries of holding a god dead had made him into a wound, and you cannot stab a hole. But I was not a god of fire or war or vengeance, however much vengeance I'd carried up from that cell. I was the carrier of the God of truth, of what things actually are, and there is exactly one weapon that destroys a lie that has been held for 300 years, and it is not a blade. It is a witness. So in the dawn light, in the burning court of House Ardyn, with 2 houses worth of survivors and penitents and brand bearers and my own 40 all frozen watching, I did not attack the Archon. I told the truth. Out loud. To everyone. And I let the God in my blood make it impossible to disbelieve. Your church murdered a god, I said, and my voice carried to every soul on that field, carried in a way that bypassed their ears and landed in the place where a person knows a thing is true. 300 years ago. Not a demon, not a heresy. A god whose only crime was that its domain was truth, and truth is fatal to people who rule by lies. They hunted its bloodline to the last child. They wrote it out of every book. They called the Silasant's holiness and built a church on the grave and have spent 3 centuries since making sure no one ever remembered. I looked at Malith and at his penitents, the nameless burned-out faithful who had given everything for a lie. Your Archon will tell you I'm a heretic. Your whole lives you've been told the silence is sacred. So I'm going to do the one thing your church has killed to prevent for 300 years. I'm going to let you remember. And I opened the god all the way, and I let it be seen. I cannot describe it properly. Language is the wrong instrument, which is fitting. But every person on that field in that moment remembered the God the church had murdered, not as a fact, as a presence. They felt all at once the truth that had been held silent for 3 centuries, that there had been something good and vast in the world whose nature was simply to make lies impossible, and that men afraid of an honest world had killed it and called the killing faith. The penitents felt it. The brand bearers felt it. And the truth landed in those nameless faithful like dawn into a cellar, and one by one they stopped, not defeated, awakened, looking down at their gray robes and their burned away names, with the dawning horror of people who have just remembered what they gave everything for and why. Malith felt it too. And here is how the Archon actually ended, not slain, but unmade by the very thing he'd given himself to hold down. For 300 years he had been nothing but the wall against the truth. And when the truth stood up in the light and was remembered, when the God he'd murdered woke and was witnessed by 1,000 people at once, there was nothing left for Malith to be. The wound has no shape without something to wall against. He looked at me, and the gray emptiness in him cracked, and for one instant, just one, I saw the man who'd existed 300 years ago, before he chose to become the holding, and that man looked unspeakably, finally tired. I only wanted the world to be safe, he whispered. Certain. Lies are so much safer than truth, boy. You'll learn. You'll build your own silence one day to keep your own world safe. No, I said. I won't. Because I was the lie, Archon. I was the thing everyone was certain about and wrong about. I spent 20 years being measured at zero by people who were so safe in their certainty they never once checked the instrument. I felt the God settle in me, vast and calm. I am never going to be certain about a person's worth again. That's the whole difference between us. You built a church to keep the world from finding out it was wrong. I'm going to spend my life making sure people keep finding out. The wound that had been Archon Malith closed, not in violence, but in something closer to release, and 300 years of held silence let go, and the Ashen Church, which had been nothing but that silence wearing robes, simply ended in the dawn light, its penitents kneeling and weeping and remembering, its purpose unmade by a single witnessed truth. I have thought, many times since, about what it must have been to be one of those penitents, to wake, that dawn, from a faith you'd burned your own name away for, and to remember all at once that the thing you'd given everything to keep buried was good, and that you had been, your whole devoted life, the instrument of a murder. Some of them broke entirely. The mind is not built to carry that much rearranged truth at once. But most of them, in the weeks after, did a thing that taught me more about people than the whole war had. They stayed. They asked to help rebuild what their order had spent centuries tearing down. A woman who'd been a brand bearer for 30 years, who'd hunted carriers like me across half a continent, came to me with the burn scar of her removed sigil still raw on her palm and asked, in a voice with nothing left in it but the question, whether a person who had done what she'd done could ever be measured as anything but worthless now. And I understood, looking at her, that this was the final test of everything I claimed to believe. It would have been so easy, so satisfying, so just, to tell her, yes, you are worthless now, you and all your kind, the instrument has finally measured you correctly. It would have been picking up the crystal. It would have been becoming Malith, becoming my father, becoming the thing that sorts the world into worthy and worthless, and feels righteous doing it. I don't measure people anymore, I told her. That was the whole point. You spent 30 years deciding who deserved to be erased. I'm not going to spend my freedom doing the same thing to you. I looked at the ruined court, the dawn, the remembered God still settling in my blood. What you were is true. You can't edit it out, not even I can do that, and I can edit almost anything. But what you are next is a thing you haven't measured yet. So go find out. That's the only sentence I have for anyone now. Go find out what you are, instead of believing what you were told. She wept, and she stayed, and she became, in time, one of Inas's most relentless scribes, hunting down the erased history with the same ferocity she'd once hunted carriers, which is, I think, the closest thing to redemption the world actually offers. Not forgetting what you were, but turning it, at last, toward the looking instead of the silence. That dawn did not just end the church. It started the looking, the thing Bran's grandmother had promised across 300 years of dark. And the looking, once it starts, does not stop. That, in the end, is the only victory that was ever worth winning. And then, in the quiet after, I turned to my father. The whole field was watching. My 40 and the Ardyn guards and the surviving nobles and Damon white and silent at the edge of it all. Lord Cael Ardyn stood in the ash of the house I had just saved, the house that had branded me defective and thrown me in a bog, and he looked at me, the worthless second son, the zero, the family shame, and I watched 20 years of cold certainty break apart behind his eyes. He did not say sorry. I never expected him to. Some men don't have the word. But Lord Cael Ardyn, patriarch of his house, who had not bowed to anyone in 40 years, lowered himself in front of 2 houses worth of witnesses and his discarded son, and he knelt. I measured you wrong, he said. It was as close to an apology as he had. The whole of your life. I measured you wrong. And here is the thing the songs really get wrong, the thing I'm proudest of, the thing that took me 20 years and a murdered God to understand. I felt no triumph. I'd spent so long imagining this exact moment, my father on his knees, the face slap to end them all, the vindication. And now it was here, and what I felt looking down at the kneeling old man who'd thrown me away was not victory. It was something quieter and sadder and far more free. I felt pity, because I finally understood that my father had measured me wrong for the same reason Malith had murdered a god. Because certainty is comfortable and checking your instrument is frightening, and most people will choose the comfortable lie over the frightening truth every single day of their lives, until something forces them to kneel in the ash and look. Get up, father, I said. I don't want you on your knees. That was never what I wanted, though I thought it was for a long time. I helped the old man stand, and I saw the confusion in him again, the man whose instrument kept giving readings he couldn't explain. I didn't come back to put you down. I came back to prove the measure was wrong, and not just about me. About everyone you ever decided was nothing. The concubine you threw away. The estate you left to die. The 40 people standing in your court right now who saved your house. You spent your life sorting the world into worth and worthless, and the worthless just saved you from a god killer. Sit with that. That's punishment enough, and it's the only kind I have any use for anymore. House Ardyn survived. That's the unglamorous truth. I didn't burn it down. Burning it down would have been picking up the instrument, deciding the Ardyns were worth erasing, becoming the thing I'd beaten. Instead, I did something my father found far harder to live with. I left it standing, diminished, and I let it survive in the long shadow of the son it had discarded, who now held more power than the house had ever dreamed of, and had chosen, pointedly, mercy. Damon inherited a lessened house and a name that for the rest of his life would be a footnote to his brothers. I'm told he became, eventually, almost a decent man, which surprised everyone, including him. The wound of being measured and found wanting can rot a person, or it can teach them. It had taught me. I like to think, on my generous days, it eventually taught him too. My father came to Hollowmere once more, years later, and that visit is the truest ending this story has, more than the battle, more than the kneeling in the ash. He came as an old man. Not as Lord Theron of House Ardyn, with furs and guards, and the cold certainty of his rank. Those had worn away in the long diminishment after the Verone collapse, the way a tide goes out and doesn't come back. He came alone, on a tired horse, an aging man who had outlived his ambitions and most of his certainty, and he asked, not commanded, to see what I had built. So I showed him. I walked my father through Hollowmere. I showed him the granary Edric had built sober, and the school where children were taught for years before anyone thought to measure them, and the workshops full of people the crystal had called nothing, and bran stone with the old word carved deep, and the fields that fed 3 valleys now, and the long hall where the failed crystal children came from across the continent to learn that the number had never been the truth. He said very little. He was a man who had spent 70 years measuring worth with a single cold instrument, walking through the living proof that the instrument had been wrong about nearly everything, and there is no speech for that. There is only the walking and the looking, which was the whole point. At the end of it, by Bran Stone, he finally spoke. I have been trying, he said slowly, since the day you saved a house that had thrown you in a bog, to understand why you did it. I have decided I will never understand it. It is not in me. I measured the whole world my entire life, Cael, and I do not know how to stop, even now, even knowing what it cost me. He looked at me, and for once there was nothing cold in it, only an old man's bafflement and grief. You are the only thing I ever made that turned out to be worth anything, and I made you by accident, and I threw you away on purpose. How do you carry that and still show me your school? And I gave him the only answer I had, the one the God in my blood had spent a whole second life teaching me. Because you're not nothing either, Father, I said. That's the secret you never learned. There isn't a worthy and a worthless. There's just people and the instruments we measure them with, and the courage to admit the instrument was wrong. You'll never get there, but you came. You came and you looked, and that's more than the man who exiled me could have done. I put my hand on Bran's stone. I didn't save your house to forgive you. I saved it to prove the measure was wrong. About me, about this estate, about everyone you ever discarded. You're just the last one on the list. He died the next winter in his diminished house, and he left me everything, which I did not need, and gave to the tenants. I did not grieve him the way you grieve a father. I grieved him the way you grieve a man who spent his whole life one realization short of being free and ran out of time. It is, I have come to think, the most common death there is. I built Hollowmere so that fewer people would have to die it. I took Hollowmere as my own, deeded free mine. The dying bog estate that the house had used as a trash heap became the seat of something new, something the world had not seen in 300 years, a place built around the remembered God of truth, where the measure of a person was not a crystal, or a core, or a name, but simply what they did and who they stood for. People came. The ones the world had measured at 0, the discarded, the defective, the low-born, the forgotten. They heard there was a place in the north where worth was measured with a different instrument, and they came, and Hollowmere grew from 40 broken souls into something I'm told they now call a sanctuary, though I've never liked the word. I just call it home. The first to come were the ones like me, the failed crystal children, the ones whose families had quietly written them off at 16 and were waiting for the convenient age to discard them entirely. Word spreads fast among the worthless. We have always had our own networks, beneath the notice of the people who sort us. A boy arrived that first winter who'd been kept in a cellar by a minor house, too ashamed to kill him and too proud to free him, measured at 0, certain he was nothing. I tested him myself, not with a crystal, but with the only instrument I trust now, which is time and attention. It turned out the boy could coax green out of dead ground the way I coaxed truth out of the world. Not a god's bloodline, just a quiet, ordinary gift the crystal had no setting to read. Within a year, he was feeding half the valley. The crystal had called him nothing. The crystal, it turns out, calls a great many things nothing, and is wrong about nearly all of them. That became the work of my life, in the end, more than the God, more than the church, more than the long overdue humbling of House Ardyn. I built a place that measured people with the right instrument, and I spent my years finding the ones the wrong instrument had thrown away and showing them the number had never been the truth. Some had gifts. Most just had the ordinary, enormous worth of a human being that no house had ever bothered to look for. It didn't matter which. The point was never the power. The point was the looking. The thing Bran's grandmother promised would start again, the thing 3 centuries of silence had been built to prevent. I made Hollowmere into a place where the looking never stopped, and that, not the battle, not the bloodline, is the thing I'd want remembered if only one thing could be. The world changed, slowly, the way real things change, not in a single dawn, but in the long quiet seasons after. Other houses, watching a discarded son turn a worthless bog into a power they had to reckon with, began grudgingly to wonder what else they'd thrown away. A few even began testing their children differently, later, with more than a crystal. It was not a revolution. It was something better and slower, a doubt, planted in the certainty that had ruled the world, growing the way buried things grow once someone finally gives them a reason to. Enos stayed and spent the rest of her life writing the true history the church had erased, so the god would never be forgotten again. Old Bran did not live to see the world she wrote it for. He died in the breach at the Ardyn seat, in the grey hour, holding a door alone so I could reach the wounded, the way he told me he wanted to go, with the looking finally started. But his grandmother's half-remembered word lives across the whole north now, Godwork, spoken openly and without fear, and the first stone I ever raised at Hollowmere bears that word, carved deep, over his name. For a forgotten soldier from a forgotten war to become the reason a buried word grows again is the rarest victory there is, and I made sure he got it. I visit the stone more than I visit anything. I tell him how the looking's coming along. It feels less foolish than you'd think. And Lyra. Lyra, who looked at the worthless defect everyone had thrown away and decided, for no profit at all, to be kind. Lyra, who refused to let me stand alone, who pulled the wounded from the fire, who said the truest thing anyone ever said to me, that nothing is just the word powerful people use for what they don't know how to measure. I did not rise to power and then reward her with a place at my side, the way the songs tell it, as though she were a prize. It was the other way around. She had been at my side since the muddy yard, since before I was anything, and everything I built around the fact of her. The power was just the wall. She was always the thing the wall was for. I married her in the spring, in the prosperous yard of a once-dying estate, with 40 souls watching, and a defected scholar, and a stone for a one-eyed veteran who'd bought the dawn we were standing in, and even, awkwardly, uninvited, much diminished, my father, who had taken to appearing at the edges of my life like a man visiting a country whose language he'd realized too late he should have learned. There was no awakening crystal at the ceremony. There was no measuring of anyone. It was the only gathering of my life where a person's worth was simply assumed, the way you'd assume the sun. And I looked around at the discarded and the defective and the forgotten all standing in the warm spring light of a place the world had written off. And I thought, this is the whole of it. This is what I was fighting for under the revenge and the bloodline and the church. Not power. A single yard anywhere in the world where no one is measured and found wanting before they've been given the chance to be anything at all. Lyra wore no crown and carried no title because we'd abolished both at Hollowmere as bad instruments. She simply stood beside me as she had since the muddy morning I arrived a broken thing, and when the old words were said, she leaned close and murmured, just for me, not bad for a zero. And I laughed, the helpless laugh of a man who has gotten, against every measure ever taken of him, immeasurably more than he was told he deserved. And that laugh is the truest record of my life that exists. Put it on the stone when it's my turn. Here lies a zero who laughed. People ask me, now at the end of it, what the moral is. They want me to say, believe in yourself, or the meek shall rise, or some other thing you can put on a banner. But I think the truth is simpler and stranger than that, and it's the one thing the God in my blood taught me that I'd give to anyone who's ever been measured at zero and told it was the truth. They measured me at zero and they called it the truth. They were wrong about the number. But more than that, and this is the part that took a God to teach me, they were wrong about the truth. Zero was never a measure of what I was. It was only ever a measure of their instrument and their certainty and their fear of a world they couldn't sort into worthy and worthless. I wasn't empty. I was the one thing their crystals were built to never see. And so, I have come to believe, is everyone they ever threw away.